Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that provides you an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world and ask how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's November 4th, 2025. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
Hey, Eric. I almost said morning because I'm focused on the time we're recording this. Both our schedules got crazy, and so we're doing a very early morning recording. I like it, though. I'm always bouncier in the morning. I'm definitely a morning gal. So if this turns out to be our best episode ever, we might have to shift to 5 in the morning Central Time recording. But I'm good. How are you?
Good. Yeah, it's a little early. I'm not as much of a morning person, but it's got to be done. Big day today, Tuesday the 4th, elections around the country. What are you watching to get those started?
I'm not going to make predictions because I think we found that over the last few elections that there's a whole lot that polling doesn't capture about sentiment. But some big races, Virginia and New Jersey governorship, Mayor of New York, and then the California prop, which I think is huge about the redistricting. One of the reasons that you and I focus so much on local, and I love that we're talking local, is if you just go to the meta level, the approach that government is taking right now is not serving the American people writ large, right? Not any specific action, but just we've grown too big or too disparate or too polarized or all those sorts of things. I don't think we can innovate at the federal level. I think the innovations that will produce new approaches to these problems that are perhaps more effective will start at the state and local level. Changeover, turnover, new blood there that are less beholden to some sort of platforms or system approach, I think might be the way that we actually solve some of the problems. Even if you have fits and starts, you still get a new breed that says there are different ways we can solve these problems, and maybe you get the innovation starting locally that'll then become what the federal innovation needs to be. Who knows? I'm always optimistic.
That's great. And hopefully I get this out in time enough for people to hear the message that get out and vote. I've got my youngest for a few hours this afternoon, and he will be joining me as the last of his brothers to go to a polling station and get out and vote. So it'll be fun.
Oh, man, I trust not going to vote, but he's a happy guy.
I'll get all my dead relatives to vote, but the baby's not going to vote.
All right. Hey, let's get on to our show.
No, this isn't Illinois. We're not voting dead relatives. This is Texas. All right. Let's get some headlines. From gold leaf desserts to a bear table in Busan, we'll discuss the president's trip to Asia and what it says about American diplomacy abroad. Talk of resuming nuclear weapons tests and upcycling old warheads. Are we powering AI's future or priming a new arms race? Insider for hire, $35 million in secrets sold to a Russian marketplace. We'll discuss when a subcontractor is in the breach. So we'll start with President Trump's trip to Asia. It was a highly performative display featuring some lavish welcomes in Malaysia, Japan, and South Korea, where allies bent over backwards with symbolic gestures and trade concessions to curry favor. There was a peacemaker's dessert of a gold-encrusted brownie on one of the locations.
So embarrassed. I'm so embarrassed. Keep going. Sorry.
The final leg, though, was a tense, stripped-down meeting with Xi Jinping, the president of China. There's a plain meeting room with a long white negotiating table in a nondescript military building just off the runway of Busan's International Airport. Let's talk a little bit about this juxtaposition between the different meetings, the lavishness, and then the stripped-down version. What I really wanted to get into is, Sue, what do these moments really say about America's leverage and what kind of international pecking order we're walking into?
Oof. We saw a lot, and I love how you presented it. Number one is it's always good to have relationships. This is one of the things that the former president has ran on. You want me to be able to talk to every world leader? I do. I'm not sure you need to always be the one talking to the world leaders. Sometimes you send messages by who you have, kind of parallel conversations with, but you need to have it. Asia is super important, and so glad he went. First, let's talk about outcome. We called this when we talked about it last week. There are a lot of announcements, but due to lack of transparency and kind of lack of showing rather than a lot of telling, I don't think we have a clue in the world what we really got out of this. There are a lot of statements, and we'll talk about China particularly. Was any harm done? I don't see much. Was any good done? I'm not sure, other than relationships. So let's leave the outcomes of the trip for time. But let me pick up your point. There are tactical shows and there are strategic shows. All the lavish celebration is people figuring out that they want a relationship with the United States. And today, who controls that relationship is the president,
Mhm.
and they have figured out how to work him. To them, they need to not be shunned and to be included. And through tariffs, he has shown that he is willing to be punitive at the slightest slight. And so I think a lot of the lavishness is a tactic to be able to, at the very least, not be punished and potentially get some sort of consideration out of it that is not particularly strategically important to the United States, but tactically important to the smaller nation states in the region. And I guess from the U.S. perspective, particularly when you're trying to counter Chinese expansionism in the Indo-Pacific region, you want to have relationships with all the nation states that you can. But that feels tactical. Man, when you get to China, that was a power meeting. One of the things that I have said is about both Xi and Putin. If I were speaking to the president, I said, listen, they're not your friends and they're not afraid of you. These are real countries with real strategic objectives that run counter, in many cases, to U.S. strategic objectives.
Right.
The world still does go through the United States, not because of the president, but rather because of what the United States represents in terms of power, resources, influence. And yes, tactically, you may need to work with our president, but the reason we are important is because of all those other things. And you see the smaller individual nations who need tactical advantage playing to the person. You actually see China being very willing to stand up to the person in order to have the strategic interests of the two nations play against each other. They have a meeting where they're not fawning over him, and they represented strength because they have objectives and they know they have, in the vernacular of the president, a hand to play. Did we get some things out of them? Maybe, time will tell, but it was almost the only gain we got was an undoing of the pain we had caused ourselves through our actions.
Right.
I don't know. Even Xi's promise not to invade Taiwan during the president's term, one, any other American president, I believe, would be offended by that statement. What do you mean?
Yeah.
My actions are not for me. My actions are not about my term. My actions are about what is right with free and open societies. Stop this. But the second thing is we also know that the assessment is that China, in its own view of itself, unlikely to do anything well before 2027. So even that doesn't seem to be much of a concession. Long-winded way of saying there's performance, there's tactics, and there's strategy. I don't think we saw any shift that was surprising on any front. We are pretty much where we were. And again, the only way you keep strategic powers at bay is to have actual national power, not performative power.
Yeah, that's a great point on the strategic, tactical, and performance. And so much of this has the element of time. But I agree that we're pretty much back at the place we started, or roughly about the place we started. We'll just have to see what happens. We don't want this to be overreaction Monday after the week one of the NFL season saying, oh, the season's over, or hey, this terrible team's going to the Super Bowl. Time will tell, but there's still things that we can see coming out of this, especially at the tactical.
Visiting regions when you're the United States is an important signal about where your values lie. So, yeah, let's not overreact. But as we always encourage people, how about if you look at the actions, not at the words, and then you'll have a much better picture of what's going on.
That's right. Staying in the strategic realm, let's talk about some of these nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
President Trump's surprise announcement that he would resume U.S. nuclear weapons testing has reignited fears of a renewed global arms race. The move appears to be based on a false premise that other nations like Russia and China are actively conducting nuclear tests. U.S. weapons labs and top defense officials say explosive tests are unnecessary, and the U.S. already leads the world in advanced non explosive testing capability. Experts warn that resuming tests would erode America's strategic advantage, invite rivals to follow suit, and destabilize the already fragile arms control environment. The U.S. hasn't tested a nuclear weapon since 1992. Experts say we don't need to. Why then would a president call for return to Cold War era testing, and what's the real risk in doing so?
I have a rule that I don't try and get in people's heads about why they would do things. But let's just talk about the issue. Yes, some experts do say that simulation can do the job of testing. There are many others who have long argued for resumption of testing because it is very difficult to determine the effects part of nuclear detonations without actual testing. So while the prevailing wind is you don't need it, that was one of the reasons why the whole moratorium was placed in 1992. But there is some argument for if you believe that nuclear weapons are going to be used, and you must prepare to understand what the effects of those nuclear weapons will be, testing is one of the few ways that you can really get to the effects piece. So just top line, it is not in every quarter settled that you can know everything without testing. Just a real quick recount of why we put the moratorium on in 92. There was actually a lot of arms control momentum in 92, public and environmental pressure about nuclear fallout from the explosive testing, whether at Nevada test site in the Pacific. We were in the middle of cleanup and all the health risks were known. There was just confidence, like you say, in simulation that we didn't have to run those risks. We could satisfy eliminating those risks satisfactorily with simulation. But there's also a big feeling that we had such an advantage that we wanted to retard the advance of nuclear weapons programs in other countries. And so by us agreeing to it, in fact, being the first signatory to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, that we would actually help stop the growth. So then what do we think about this proposal? One, it feels ridiculously casual and maybe based on the statement, based on some fundamental misunderstanding of what our adversaries and competitors are doing and what we need to do. It feels like it came right on the heels of Russia announcing that they had a nuclear-powered cruise missile. And this may have been our president's reaction to, my God, we got to show them that we've got nuclear capability too. It didn't feel like it was a proposal that was reflective of either the history or the reality of where we were. The other thing I'll say is, if you were to resume nuclear testing, if you somehow could overcome the impact globally on spurring on other people's programs, overcoming public reaction to resuming environmentally difficult things, just the time, money, and expertise it would take to restart a testing program, there is real question if we could muster those in any reasonable time frame. So not a completely zero proposal in the abstract, because there has been some argument over whether we harmed ourselves in terms of preparedness and deterrence by not being able to test effects. There is nothing about this proposal that I think is mature enough to have a national debate about whether we would want to do it or not. I hate it when the president particularly is casual about his proposals because he is the president and people start reacting. But this is one that would take much more thought and effort. And again, national discussion about whether the benefit outweigh the second and third order effects, whether those are financial or geopolitical.
Yeah, that's a great point. And regardless of whether we're going to be doing testing or not, the nuclear stockpile is aging.
Yep.
And so the U.S. government is looking towards upcycling, if you could call it that.
I like upcycling. It's directional. Vectors are better than lines.
That's important. The government has invited private energy firms to apply for access to up to 19 metric tons of Cold War era weapons grade plutonium, with the aim of converting it into fuel for advanced civilian reactors. The plan is pitched as a strategic move to break foreign uranium supply chain dependencies and to accelerate some domestic reactor innovation. One of the firms expecting to apply is Oklo, a nuclear startup backed and formerly chaired by OpenAI CEO Sam Altman. Oklo was awarded fuel for its first reactor from Idaho National Labs in 2019 and has self-proclaimed the most regulatory traction of any advanced fission power system to date, and targeting first deployment in 2027. In October, Oklo was one of 4 U.S. companies chosen by the Department of Energy to join a new pilot program meant to rush the testing and approval of experimental reactors design. They have this cool modular kind of A-frame longhouse looking thing.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the energy demands of AI since the beginning of this show and how diversification is the best answer. That includes nuclear, but it also signals a major shift in the boundary between civilian energy policy and military nuclear materials.
Yep.
While this could help revive the U.S. nuclear fuel leadership, it raises questions about proliferation risk, regulatory oversight, and the durability of long-standing arms control norms that we just talked about. So how do you interpret the decision to redirect plutonium from the U.S. weapons stockpile into private advanced reactors? Is this innovation or just adding too much additional risk?
So I like this one better than the first piece of this discussion over restarting nuclear testing for a couple reasons. I like it because our energy demands, you and I talked early on, maybe in our first episode, you do need to consider nuclear to meet these needs. That I know our generation think about 3 Mile Island and all the risks, but there has been so much done in terms of fast reactors and things that I think it's important that we continue to innovate in this area. So I like this one better, and I think it's a creative approach. These are warheads that are being decommissioned, and so it's not immediately obvious that we're diminishing any sort of national security capability from a military perspective, but we are potentially translating it into another national security capability, which is energy self-sufficiency.
Yep.
And it is true, because of our regulatory environment, we are not the leaders in the way that we'd like to be, either for our own needs or for globally. So I like this one better. It doesn't bother me. I love considering the possibilities. Now, here are my caveats. One is I have the exact same time, money, and expertise concerns
Yeah.
with this. I always cite our nuclear capability as one of the best examples of national security involvement in an emergent technology, because by being so inextricably bound, we actually did manage a lot of the risks, as evidenced by how few accidents there have really been over time. And I just worry that with the same loss of expertise that we have because we haven't been testing for so many years, that where's the expertise going to come to really be able to do this in a meaningful way? And who's going to pay for this? I love Sam Altman with his trillion-dollar valuation if he's going to pick up all the costs of it, but where's the time and the money going to happen? So, like it theoretically, I have the same casualness worry that I did with the first one, even though I'm not sure the impacts are as profound. But then let's just talk about geopolitics and the impact globally. One of the things that we have not been as successful as I'd like us to be, and that's why I keep on droning on about it, is the more you have private enterprise making decisions about national security, the more you have to question whether they have the same focus and intention and ability to make national security their primary consideration. Sam Altman's primary consideration is shareholder value. So if you turn too much over to the private sector, including what has for long been considered the keys to the kingdom in terms of international security, and that is relatively few people have a nuclear capability, man, what happens with insider threat? What happens with control of the material? What happens in terms of, if you're going to do that, I'm going to do this? There are real national security considerations that are not as simplistic as we have this aging stockpile, we can reuse them in order to buttress an industry that we think is important. So to me, this one is a cool idea, but there is national interest in how it would be effective to ensure that we haven't made the world less safe.
Yeah, I think it's a no-fail mission effectively
Right.
too for a lot of
Right.
those risks you said because public sentiment is very tentative on nuclear. I think we're moving in that direction and more people are accepting of it, but you have one issue
Right.
and then folks will be like, absolutely not, and not in my backyard. Whereas right now, I agree with you. I think the technology is there. Shit, you can put in my literal backyard one of these small things
Right.
and pay me plenty of rent. But that's the power we need. And there are two theories on this AI scaling, right? It's either that, hey, your power bill is going to go up exponentially because all these data centers are drawing power and there's not as much to go around. So consumers are going to have to start footing the bill from your house. Or the technology is going to advance so rapidly that they're not going to need as much power. The GPUs aren't going to have such a high demand. And I'm a little skeptical of the latter. I think folks are going to start seeing their power bills creep up and up, not just because of the inflation, but because of the demand of AI across the board.
We seem to have had this shift, and you see it in the Doge efforts of the move fast and break things, which has long been the mantra of Silicon Valley. That does not work for every technology. And if you proceed without some constraints or some seriousness of purpose, you actually can create problems that you didn't intend, but far worse, didn't even envision. I like the we're going to have to do somethingness, and this is something that would help it. But I think we need a lot more discussion about how it's going to happen and what the boundaries are on what can be done.
Yep.
Yeah.
You mentioned insider threat there. It's something we've talked about before on this podcast. We want to talk about a recent cyber incident where a former employee at Trenton, an L3 Harris Technologies subsidiary that developed hacking tools for the government, this individual pleaded guilty to stealing around $35 million in sensitive cyber trade secrets from a cleared defense contractor and attempting to sell them to a Russian state-affiliated buyer. The Australian national, who's now a former director at Trenton, Peter Williams, 39, made the sales between 2022 and 2025 when he had access to the defense contractor's secure network and stole cyber secrets, selling them for crypto. This case underscores the growing national security risks posed by insider threats and the complex web of private actors involved in defense supply chains. Shout out to Bloomberg's Katrina Manson for putting the story on our radar. Sue, from your experience, what's the biggest blind spot in how we secure the commercial players who support national security?
Well, first, it's kind of like everything old is new again. This is the Falcon and the Snowman, right? You need humans to be working in your companies, and humans have access to information, and they have real vulnerabilities that can be used by adversaries and competitors who want something from them. And so I think this is a very classic aspect of espionage. It isn't new that it's going on within the industrial community. It's not a new actor, Russia, seeking to be the buyer in order to understand where we are. And so, on the one hand, it's a really old story. On the other hand, it's how many places you need to secure in order to ensure that you aren't losing the advantage that our programs have done. And you and I laud the introduction of all the new defense companies that are creating new technologies,
Yep.
that the Secretary of the Army at the AUSA conference is saying we are going to break down barriers to be able to buy those quickly. And we love what it introduces in terms of our ability to both have technical advantage, but also global leadership because our companies are fabulous and the best. But how many nodes do we need to protect from this kind of attack? And how much money? Because when companies spend money on cybersecurity and on insider threat, that's overhead, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, we talk about they're motivated by shareholder value. That just limits how much they're returning on their investment. And so, one, read the article that Katrina wrote, and you will have a picture of just how much is going on in how many companies because her ability to report on this and show it is remarkable. But we have got to not just view this as almost like ransomware, where companies increasingly are paying the ransom just so they can get back to business. And I get that from a corporate perspective, I do, but from a national perspective, we become Civ-like in terms of how much of our intellectual property is running out the door. But the other piece is we have come to believe that espionage is increasingly technical, where you see that so much of it is human enabled. And so we've talked about the companies that are doing insider threat work. If you are someone who's doing national security work, really, you have to do it part and parcel with good physical security, good personnel security, good technical security, and then you need the ability to make sure that this sort of thing isn't happening.
Too many companies view it as a cost center, but
Absolutely.
from my aviation background, aviation safety is a very similar issue where it's very hard to measure your metric of success.
Yep.
Did we just not have any incidents? Did we not have any problems? So why are we spending all this time and energy and money on the program when we didn't have a problem? But you can see from this example particularly, how likely is Trenton to get another contract to work on this? They have to really go back and validate that they've implemented controls, or they may not have another contract. And it's not just national security too, but it's intellectual property
Right.
from your company that you're able to lose.
We haven't talked about this as much. It's not that cybersecurity isn't a consideration. I mean, it's a huge industry. Trillions of dollars are spent on it. Many companies, their chief information security officer, their CISO, spends all their time to protect their networks, protect their information. Good offense will always beat a good defense. It just will. One of the things that needs to happen with these companies is not just to make sure that you have all the systemic and the kind of compliant responsive solutions, but you really need to start having at the leadership in the C-suite, at the boards of directors, conversation about risks, right? I am a company doing X. I'm selling it to this government entity for the purpose of Y. What's the risk of that getting exposed? And then what am I doing to ensure that risk is being managed, which is a very different thing from presuming that you can cover all your endpoints securely. This fundamental misunderstanding of how involved humans are still in what looks like electronic espionage is, I think, a super vulnerability that if we talked about risk, we would get to this a little bit better.
What's the snowman and the falcon?
Oh, back in the early days when the only people really collecting things were nation states, that was a well-known case of two folks who worked at a contractor that were building a capability for the intelligence community to be able to collect information clandestinely. And these two were basically recruited just based on offering them money, and they shared secrets of the capability of that asset. Look it up. It's a movie. Who's in it? Who played Harvey Milk? I'm trying to think of who that actor is. Anyway, Falcon and Snowman, good movie. But it's really essentially this story just put in a more physical setting where they had to take information out of safes and do a dead drop with a handler rather than just being able to download a bunch of files and take it home and then upload it to a Dropbox someplace else. So story is old as time. Used to be relatively fewer players in sensitive capabilities, and now with the proliferation and our need to innovate, it's every company who deals with the government that holds a piece of our national and global security, and if you're not recognizing the environment in which you're working, you run the risk of inadvertently creating a problem for the nation. But as you said, that company's gonna have a hard time getting business again if they aren't able to prove that they can securely handle information, so
Falcon Snowman, a 1985 American spy drama featuring
Timothy
Timothy
Hutton.
Hutton.
Yep, and who else?
Sean
Mm.
Penn.
Oh, God, yes. Anyway, really good, cute, and like I said, go watch it. It's a piece of our history. It's a piece of my history, but also it's this story, different setting, and back then, there were only 1 or 2 targets our adversaries could go after. Now it's infinite.
Yeah, let's see if I can find a VHS and a
Ah!
VCR to watch.
Sean Penn.
Yep. Moving into the rest of the week, what are you watching?
I think for me, the Supreme Court tomorrow that really hears arguments on the tariffs, that is super consequential just in terms of maybe for me, reestablishing one of the branches of government that seems to have not performed as a check and balance that it was imagined to be. So, I know just that decision about this thing that has been prescribed as a congressional responsibility, if it is waved away using the term emergency as broadly without any proof and without any oversight, I think that's worrisome. With the broad use of tariffs that the president has imposed, if it is viewed as something he doesn't have the authority to do, man, I think that ensues a scramble and fights and just more chaos in terms of what the meaning of the word is in terms of the things. So I think this is a big decision, both for the people who are worried about the democracy side and just for the functioning of the government in this administration as in any administration. So probably that's the biggest thing. The shutdown has just gotten to be an embarrassment. And I am so sorry that I used that word. We aren't talking enough about the human impact of this. So
Oh,
I was there for the 35-day one in the first Trump administration. When you start missing your second paycheck with the prospect of a third coming with no urgency, and you see your leadership basically saying, "No, I'm not doing it." I don't have more words to say about it, but to the women and men that are trying to continue to do their job without compensation, I'm I'm sorry. I'm sorry that we're here. Did we say go vote
today, yeah. Yeah,
today?
November 4th. Yep.
Yep.
Go vote. For me, watching Nvidia just across $5 trillion company valuation. I don't get it. I mean, they were a $4 trillion company in July. So a lot of folks have been talking about potential AI bubble and some of the circular financing that they've been doing recently between reinvesting in each other, NVIDIA giving money to OpenAI and back to NVIDIA.
It does
Bears
it
watching.
it does feel a little bubble-ish, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. As you see the number of deals that seem to involve all the same players, not only with kind of the insider scratching back, "I'll support you, you support me," but also just how it's playing out internationally with other
Yeah.
deals. It does feel that behind it may be not as much strength as you might need to preclude another bubble. It does. Yes.
Yeah. Smells more like 99 than '08.
Um,
Because I don't
yeah.
think there's as much like not deception, just baked in overvalued stuff like the mortgage crisis, but .com bubble maybe, and we'll see. And I'm not
Maybe
saying it's going to be tomorrow, but I think there's a little bit overvaluation here and looking for a market correction probably in the next, I don't know, a year or so is what most folks are saying.
yeah, so I don't think we have enough time to talk about this kind of what's going on in the market, what's going on with the company valuations, and what's going on with the economy, and how do those things all resolve, and what look like fundamentals and what are new fundamentals. I think these are all really good conversations, but it does feel like how can that much value be created that quickly?
A trillion
That's right. That's
with a
right.
T.
Without, because what we haven't talked about in terms of the AI piece is there is real question whether the gains really are yet worthy of the promise everyone seems to be invested in. So maybe it's not with the kind of sketchiness that previous ones have been, but this does feel like a lot of betting on promise that
Yep.
hasn't yet been realized, so I like that one, Eric, I like that.
Yeah, and it ties into the AI action plan we were looking
Yeah,
at. I think we
yeah.
called that end of October. They were supposed to put something out, and they did put out an exports plan from the Department of Commerce. There wasn't a whole lot into it, but there was a request for information inviting public commentary and some U.S. and global technology companies to help shape the program. They've got a new website, aiexports.gov, and you can fill out a survey. So they are continuing to move in that direction, but not a whole lot of things to report yet.
I like it that they're opening it up. I like that they're soliciting input from companies, which again is more private sector involvement since they are the big actors. But I do wonder what new age regulation is going to look like because you can't, like I say, market forces alone will not lead this country or the world in the place that it really wants to be from a risk perspective. And so until I see what regulation looks like in 2025 or beyond when it isn't the government that's controlling everything, but you do have strategic risks that has to be accounted for, I will be worried that it's a little bit of window dressing more than it is actual outcome.
Yeah, another thing I'm watching is Nigeria. Over the weekend, President Trump threatened military troops if they don't stop killing Christians in Nigeria. So, interested in monitoring President Abuja's response to that intervention threat. Nigeria is Africa's most populous country, 237 million folks. The next most populous is Ethiopia with 135 million. So, very big country there, lots of natural resources, lots of oil, and reminds me of the art of the deal. Make a big splash, punch your opponent in the face, and then wait for reaction and then make some deals. He's very focused on oil. We've seen this with Venezuela, I think, and then we'll see what's coming of Nigeria.
Absolutely. A through line of this president's action is financial, right? These are economic plays, even when they seem to be militarily enforced. I have too much history, too much seeing the United States being a defender of small countries against big countries to now see my country as a bully and threatening to use its overwhelming power to shape even what it considers to be wrongs. Again, the word casual comes to mind. I think there are second and third order effects. And again, this hopefully America was around for a lot longer than any particular action. So just getting the satisfaction of being able to threaten someone because you're so much more powerful and get an outcome that is narrow, but at what cost to our strategic positioning, I worry after. But I like the call out. I think one of the challenges about Nigeria is, yes, it has all those attributes, but governmentally, it is one of those African nations that is really torn between lots of different factions
Hmm.
that want to control the government and trying to keep that balance in, and a very aggressive China in that country as well for all the reasons that you said. So not a simplistic play at all, even though the action feels in some ways capricious to me.
All right, we've got one more thing here. It just got news that former Vice President Dick Cheney passed away at the age of 84. Vice President during the Bush administration, a continuing legacy in terms of executive power and executive privilege, former Secretary of Defense, I believe. So wanted to see if you had any comments or thoughts on former Vice President Dick Cheney passing away at 84.
Well, I'm sorry for the family's loss. I guess maybe it's just a sign of the times. He was vice president and active in the political sphere kind of when I was senior enough in the intelligence community to actually be focused on policymakers rather than having my head down. So here's what I know to be true is his last part of his political career will be the subject of discussion for the next, well, throughout history, but for the next few days. And some will use him as evidence of everything that's wrong. And some will use him as evidence of how we ought to behave. Both of those will do a disservice to the whole life And so what I would just say is we lost an 84-year-old man who lived both a life of private sector accomplishment and public service.
Yep.
Try and go up a little bit and see the value of the aggregate, not just the specific incident that you want to use for your agenda, and instead celebrate a life and help a family mourn a loss.
Yep. Our thoughts are with the family, and sorry for their loss. Well, that's what we're watching. Thank you for joining us. No doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people. Go vote.
Thanks for joining us. So as always, remember, we're here for you. We are on an increasing number of platforms. So whether it's where you listen to your podcast, YouTube, or our newest venue, Instagram, send us a comment and tell us what you like and what you don't, and what you need and what you hope. So join us next week. And until then, go forth, do good, and as always, be kind to one another. Thanks.